Hello and welcome everyone to Spiritual Talk. Thank you for joining us again on this Wednesday evening. Hello, mate.
Hiya, mate. Good to be back. How are you?
I'm good. It's Wednesday. It's 8 o'clock. It's Spiritual Talk again. And we've got a brilliant guest tonight, haven't we?
Oh, we have.
We've got a right treat. Now, unfortunately, it was a pre-record, but we kind of got two pre-recordings because this gentleman is so interesting. We got talking afterwards, and there was something else we wanted to talk about. So there's two clips.
Yeah.
So bear with us. We will show it in its entirety, both clips, and we really hope you enjoy it. Just going to say hello to a few people. Hi, Sharon. Hi, Emma. Hi. Good to see everyone. Hi, Carol. Hi, Lou.
Hi,
Good
Sharon.
to see everyone joining on tonight. Guys, don't forget to share. We are going to do... We forgot the other week, didn't we, buddy?
We did.
Well, honestly, COVID has given me a bit of a brain fog since I've had that. Yeah, it's taken a little while to get back onto planet Earth, but I'm coming back slowly. So it's good to be back.
Good.
So please share and get everything out there. It'll be really wonderful. And
Hi,
yeah, mate, I'm not even done the banner. Here you go. Here's the banner. So let's talk about tonight's guest, mate.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, really interesting. So the guest tonight is David Charles Rowan. David is a professional astrologer and master practitioner of the Neuro-Holistic therapy. It's a synthesis, apparently, of NLP, hypnotherapy, and psychology. He both teaches from his home as well, and online courses he does. He's also, interestingly, he's also a poet and a singer-songwriter. Which I didn't know. And also he has 2 master's degrees, one in science and one in art.
Yeah.
But this interview, guys, is really interesting. So bear with us. We will pick someone for a reading at the end of the show. So please keep sharing. I'll be able to watch tonight who's sharing. And hopefully we can, well, I think it's your turn, mate, is it?
It's my turn this time.
It's your turn. Yeah. Okay, guys.
Keep sharing, everyone.
Yeah, here we go. I'm going to play it live now, so bear with me. Here we go. Good morning, David. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Morning,
Good morning. Thank you for having me here.
It's a pleasure, absolute pleasure for agreeing to be on. Now, on Spiritual Talk, we'd like to know all about our guests and your chosen subject today. And when I say chosen subject, because you have mastered many subjects, but your chosen subject, or you're known for being an astrologist, is that right?
Astrologer.
Okay. So we'd like to know how you got started. How did you get on that journey?
Oh God, right. Yeah, I got into astrology because I was totally and utterly confused. I have 3 autistic conditions, so I've got Asperger's syndrome, dyslexia, dyspraxia, but I didn't get diagnosed till I was 40. So when I was young, I was different, but I didn't know why. And I was just completely bewildered by humans and humanity. I grew up with a disabled mum, and so my dad's attention constantly revolved around her. So I didn't have anyone to ask questions of. Right. And I strongly remember when I was about 10 years old, and I saw some footage of the liberation of Belsen on TV, and it freaked me out.
Yeah.
Not just because of what happened, but I thought, that's a civilized society. I live in a civilized society. That civilized society did that. What if my civilized society does that? And it just kind of fired up this kind of need to know or understand people and the human condition. So I think the first thing that really kind of got me thinking about people and nature and the nature of us was a David Bowie song. I listened to an album called Hunky Dory when I was about 11, and there was a song in there called Quicksand. And I didn't know that when Bowie wrote that, he was about that far away from becoming a Buddhist monk.
Oh, wow.
Because he'd read about the stuff that was happening in Tibet by China, and that got him to look into that. And he, so when you look at the lyrics of a lot of the songs on Hunky Dory, they've got a lot of Buddhist ideas and concepts inside them. So I couldn't, my dad wouldn't answer these questions. So I went to the local library, this little 11-year-old kid kind of barely looking over the counter. And I said, have you got any books on the Bardo and a Golden Dawn? So I come away with Tibetan Buddhism and Aleister Crowley things. I was 11. Right?
Yeah.
When I was 12, I thought I'd better understand politics. So I got this book called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich and the Abridged Works of Karl Marx. And I was looking at them side by side, trying to kind of get an idea of the extremes of politics. I picked up an introduction to Freud when I was about 13 and dismissed it when I was about 13 and a half because I thought it was rubbish, some of it. Not all of it, but some of it. And then I just kind of looked for things. I found numerology, Pythagorean numerology, when I was about 17. And a numerology book said that planets correlate with numbers. So that led me to looking at astrology a bit more seriously. And I found that this language, if you think of astrology as a language, doesn't carry any biases with it. There's no religion involved. There's no deity involved. There's no philosophy or politics intrinsically within it. It's just a language of symbols. Yeah. And so this ancient art, somebody on Facebook said to me once, describe astrology in one sentence. See if you can do it. So quick as anything, I replied, astrology is an ancient art that employs polysemous symbols to describe the structure of subjective experience.
Wow. So
polysemy means multiple layers of meaning. So all words have multiple meanings attached to them. Yeah. So when I teach neuro-holistic therapy, on the first training day, quite often, if there's a training thing, and people arrive on the first day, they're all strangers, they're getting to know each other. Yeah. And if a training day is going to start at 10, people might start arriving at 1:45, so they're sitting and they're kind of rummaging through their bag for a pen, and someone's making tea and hello, who are you, where are you from, that kind of thing. So in amongst the kind of the chaos of the beginning of a training day with strangers, and I'm walking backwards and forwards at the kitchen, I do this every single time. It's always the same wording. I kind of say, oh yeah, anyway, yeah, I went to Cornwall a couple of weeks ago, stayed in a nice hotel. I just kind of throw that in. Do you want chamomile tea? And then after a few minutes, I said to everyone, oh, by the way, do you remember I mentioned I went to Cornwall the other week? And they all stop what they're doing and kind of go, yeah. This is before the class started. So they're not expecting anything, it's pre-work. And they go, yeah. And I said, when I said I stayed in a hotel, what did you imagine in your head? And you'll find that out of a room of about half a dozen people, someone might say a converted farmhouse, someone might say a Holiday Inn or a glass skyscraper or B&B, And then I'd say to them, right, so the word hotel is the surface structure, the expression of the dynamic, but attached to that is a pyramid of meaning. And every single nuance of the word hotel is attached to that expression. Yeah. So when you say a word in a sentence to a person, you know what your subjective intention is for the meaning of that word. Yeah. But the recipient can select in their brain any of the nuances that are attached to it. So when someone comes in a consulting room and they say, I'm depressed, how do you know what they mean? Yeah. And you've got two choices, really. You can guess the meaning, which is always going to be a 50-50 variable, or you can do a thing called ask. And that's really the only way to know what they mean by that. Yeah. And then I spend the next 2 years teaching them how to ask well. So so if a symbol carries 1,000 words and a word carries 1,000 meanings, then the language of astrology is rich. It's very rich in its potential. And I found it gave me a framework of understanding myself. And it took me about 7 years to get my head around it, because it's a very confusing thing. Trying to understand the entire breadth of humanity takes more than 5 minutes. Yeah. And then by about 1991, a lot of people started asking me questions, but people coming for readings, but their questions were always the same. They asked me the same things all the time. And so I just found it is easier to kind of get people in the same room at the same time. Just they can ask a question once, or at least, and that started my kind of teaching career. And I've been teaching for 31 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. You're clearly a very intelligent man, David. You've also got 2 masters as well.
Yeah, I was among the first 6 people to get a Master of Arts degree in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology.
Wow.
So that was set up 20 years ago this year. Nick Campion, who is now Dr. Nicholas Campion, started to go to a conference called INSAP, which is the Inspiration of Astronomical Phenomena. So prior to COVID, about every 3 or 4 years, academics get together and they talk about the cosmos and what it means to them. But it's a mixture of left brain, right brain people. So you have particle physicists, chemists, astrophysicists, just scientists in general, poets, artists, astronomers, astrologers, and they deliver papers on how they relate with the universe. And so you might find one person, an artist, might give a talk on how he's inspired by curved light. And then you'll have the next guy talking about how his job is to stand for life in the universe. It's an astonishing thing to be allowed to go to. Nick Campion went to 1 or 2 of these, and he thought there's something here about how these people relate to astrology and astronomy in a cultural sense. So he set up the MA at Barcelona University. It's essentially like the INSAP course in a way. So it's not learning about astrological technique or how to be an astrologer. It's looking at its position within culture, within religion, within music, within art, within poetry, within stories, within narrative, and things like this. And so it was the first academic course to have astrology as its topic on British university soil for 400 years.
Wow.
Because astrology used to be ubiquitous. It was everywhere in society.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. If you read Chaucer, he's talking about the lady talks about her Venus. If you look at Shakespeare, they go to the Temple of Mars in As You Like It before they begin their kind of adventures. Even Romeo and Juliet, it's the most famous love story of all. And the opening lines he talks about the star-crossed lovers.
Yeah.
The star-crossed lovers. That's got astrology right at the beginning of the most famous love story. And even now, if you go to the Houses of Parliament in our technical age, you'll see guys wearing black kind of frock coats.
Yeah.
And they run around and they're messengers. So they have little messages from one minister to another, and they literally run around the building, right, with these written messages. And they have a piece of metal in front of them. The piece of metal is a circle with a cross underneath it and kind of little horns coming off, a crescent coming off of its head, which in astrology we would recognize as the symbol for the planet Mercury. And Mercury is the Roman name of the planet, but the Greek name is Hermes. Right? And so most scholars, when they study antiquity, they tend to err towards the Greek. Very few people kind of go down the Roman road, although people do, but most of the time people look at Greek philosophy because they gave us democracy and Olympics and things like this. And so I knowingly walked up to this guy and said, "Oh, excuse me, what's that thing you've got hanging around your neck?" And quite proudly he said, "This is a piece of the crown jewels." I said, "Oh, what's it called?" He said, "It's called Mercury." So they're using the Roman name, which is what we use in astrology. So that kind of reveals something. And I think up until about 1671, there were resident astrologers in Parliament.
Oh, wow.
And the thing that did it was you notice that Christmas Day is the same day every year, 25th of December.
Yeah.
You can literally set your calendar by it. But Easter varies around. It moves around. And the reason is because Easter Sunday is the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox.
Yeah.
So if you don't know when the spring equinox is, and you don't know when the full moon is, you don't know when it's Easter.
Yeah.
And the only people who could calculate that in antiquity were the astrologers, because astrology and astronomy were wedded together. They were the same thing. And it wasn't until the age of reasoning that I guess Western magical tradition started to get kind of separated from its mechanics. So if you get, say, alchemy, and you remove the philosophy, what you're left with is chemistry. Okay. So chemistry has its history in alchemy. If you get astrology, which is the notion of imbuing the sky with meaning, and you remove that philosophy, so there's no meaning attached to the sky anymore, what you're left with is data, and that's astronomy.
Right.
So astronomy looks at phenomena, whereas astrology gives meaning to phenomena.
Yeah.
And that's the essential difference between the two. So by around the beginning of the 1600s, the Royal Society had already begun, and the Christians didn't like any opposing ideas or thought, as you know, persecutions and Spanish Inquisition and fighting the Islamics and all of the rest of it. But they had to allow astrology to continue, because we were the only people who could calculate Easter. And I think it was about 1200 in the 12th century, St. Thomas Aquinas wrote a thing separating astrology in half itself. He said that there was natural astrology, which is the astrology of weather, of seasons, of planting, right, of tides. But there's also judicial astrology, which is to make a judgment upon a person. And he said only God can make a judgment upon a person. So judicial astrology is bad, but natural astrology is fine. And that meant the church could allow the astrologers to continue living without persecution that much, right? Because they needed them for the Easter calculation. But once science had started to be at an astronomy got going, and people could look at the sky and you didn't need to imbue meaning anymore, that meant the astrologers were now kind of superfluous, really. We were not needed anymore. Yeah. And it was the Civil War that did it. So they said to the astrologers, who's going to win, Parliament or the king? And of course, some astrologers sided with the Parliament because it looked very kind of even. Other astrologers sided with the crown. So when they cut the king's head off, they said, aha, these astrologers are discredited. And when they restored the crown, they said, aha, these astrologers are discredited, which didn't need much. Yeah. And so we got kicked out of universities in 1671, and astrology went into a backwater. And a kind of an observer about 100 years later, a guy called Cadbury, wrote that astrology is for farmers, women, and the vulgar. And it started to become more popular again in the 1800s or 1900s. A guy called Raphael started to kind of talk about astrology charts and things that became more popular but it was also outlawed as well. Now, this is going to sound a bit strange, but it's a genuine thing. I don't know if you noticed that on our television screens, on terrestrial TV, Channel 4, BBC, ITV, they have documentaries about everything under the sun, including the sun itself, except for a serious discussion about astrology. Oh. And the reason is it's against the law. They're not allowed to talk about astrology seriously. And the reason for that is Napoleon. See, Napoleonic wars were terrible things. Those wounds and bayonets were awful. They didn't have anesthetic. They didn't have antibiotics. And so after the Napoleonic wars, almost every major city in Europe was filled with these terribly wounded men. And out of desperation, they would beg in the streets. Yeah. They would do things with dice. They'd say they could read your palm, bumps on your head, all sorts of things. And we don't have a cafe society. It's too cold, right? Yeah. And the French have a cafe society, but there are certain kind of latitudes of northern France that are further north than some latitudes of southern England. And yet we don't have a cafe society. Yeah. So it's not to do with temperature, it's to do with culture. Yeah. And the French tolerated their wounded men being on the streets and begging, but the British didn't. We didn't like it. So I think it was 1815, they created the Vagrants and Vagabonds Act. And all the things these guys were doing were put under this thing. So saying they could tell your fortune, read your palm, all that kind of thing. And it started to clear the streets of these vagrants. And in around 1824, they added astrology to the list. So astrology became illegal. And the police would have honey traps. They'd have a reading. And when the astrologer asked for money, the handcuffs would go down. And there was a theosophist called Alan Leo, and he was famously taken to court twice for practicing astrology. And the second time, to the kind of dismay and scandal of the time, he was fined £5 because he was found guilty. And I think it was 1922 with the birth of Princess Margaret. The Daily Mail, of all things, put her birth chart on the front page. And that began the whole thing about sun signs and newspapers and media with astrology.
Okay.
Kind of, yeah. But if you think of like all human skills have a range of competence. So you've got mastery at one end and please stop at the other end. Right? So if you use musical genres as a scale of sophistication, you could say that there's the X factor at one end of the scale of sophisticated music and Beethoven at the other end of sophisticated music, and maybe Led Zeppelin in the middle. Right? Yeah. So all of the media stuff and all the things that say you're a Taurus, you're a Gemini, etc., all of that is the X factor end. And I aspire towards the Beethoven end. So we don't have the notion there are only 12 kinds of people. We have the notion there are 7.7 billion different types of people. Each one has their own particular perspective of the universe from their own subjective position, and their birth charts are completely unique. Even twins have differences in their birth charts.
So that's interesting itself. So how does that look then, David? The Beethoven side of astrology, you're the higher, the finesse, how does that look from an academic point of view?
From an academic point of view, oh, that's an interesting question. Well, what we would do in order, for example, if I was going to talk to you about your astrology, I'd take your date of birth, your place of birth, the location, the town, the city, and your exact time of birth. And from that, we can draw a map, a symbolic map of the positions of the planets, how they would have looked from exactly that location at exactly that time. And the birth time is very important.
Yeah.
So although in any 24-hour period, all the planets are roughly in the same position, the moon moves fairly quick, but everything else is going to be in the same place. So all the children born on planet Earth today, in this 24-hour period, will all have the planets in the same positions relatively. But the thing that changes, of course, is the Earth spinning on its axis.
Yeah.
Right? And the easiest way to think of this, you ever seen anybody repair a bicycle?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. They have a bicycle upside down, and the back wheel doesn't turn because it's attached to chains and pedals, but the front wheel freely revolves, and there's a valve for tire, pumping up the tire. And because it's heavy, the valve always goes down to the bottom.
Yeah.
And the valve is in a fixed place relative to the two spokes on either side of it. And if you put your hand on the rim of the wheel and you turn it, the valve will go up in the air. It's still in the same place relative to the two spokes on either side, but now it looks like it occupies a different spatial position.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the Earth makes a rotation every 24 hours. The zodiac that we look at in astrology isn't the star constellations. We look at a thing called the ecliptic, which is the sun's apparent path around the Earth. And that's 360 degrees. So if you divide that by 12, you get 12 sections of 30 degrees.
Yeah.
Right? And in a 24-hour period, that means that the horizon will move through a sign of the zodiac once every 2 hours.
Right.
And if that sign of the zodiac is comprised of 30 degrees, then you get a different degree rising approximately once every 2.5 minutes. So two twins born in the same place, and yet, say, 15 minutes apart, there could potentially be a difference of 7 degrees on the horizon. Right. And we make angular calculations to those degree points, to those the ascendant point. And so for one twin, there could be an angle present, and for the other twin, it's not there. So, there will be differences in their charts, subtle differences, but differences.
That's interesting. My partner has twins, and they are totally different characters.
Yeah, I was a twin.
Ah.
Yeah, and so and I in my classes I use his and my chart to kind of illustrate these differences.
Yeah.
He didn't survive, but I did, and so there's got to be something in those charts to kind of suggest, although both in difficulty, one's got just that edge to survive, and the other one hasn't.
Yeah.
It is a fascinating thing. In my teaching, I do an introduction course, which is about 18 weeks. And I call it an introduction course. A lot of people think it's a mind-blowing experience, really, because we look at the history of astrology. We look at history through the lens of astrology. You can't presume that everyone's got kind of psychological knowledge. So on one day, we look at psychological kind of structures, things like fight and flight, repression, suppression, the difference between those two, little bits of neuroscience as well, just so that everyone's on the same page of understanding some basic things of psychology. We look at an esoteric, we have a day of esoteric philosophy. So, you have to look at fate and free will, really. Do we have existential free choice? In which case, astrology is a straitjacket saying you are this, you are that.
Yeah.
You can be anything. Then again, are we fated to live out certain things? In which case, astrology is pointless, because if it's your fate to be a certain thing, looking at it isn't going to change it.
Yeah.
So where is astrology in between those two poles?
Yeah.
And what is it? We also have to look at, why is an astrological birth chart drawn from the first breath? Why isn't it from conception?
Yeah.
And so then you're really talking about, when does life begin? And for some people get murdered because of their opinions about this. So it's a very sensitive and tender topic, but you have to discuss it because it's the edifice on which astrology is standing.
Absolutely.
And so that means then you then end up kind of looking at notions of reincarnation and the journey of soul, and the purpose of life itself, and where astrology fits with all that. And so, so people find themselves experiencing all this kind of stuff long before we even look at a chart. And we look at astrology as a language as well. Why are the symbols that shape? What is it about these shapes? How do you read the meanings in those?
Yeah.
Show people that even the squiggles and the wiggles in astrology are actually a language. And there's two ways around kind of learning this, I guess. You can memorize it, or you can understand it. And I find that if a person memorizes things, when they're under pressure, they have amnesia. You see this in quiz shows. I remember watching the old version of The Weakest Link once, and she said, "With what part of an egg do you make a meringue?" And the guy went, "The inside." Well, yeah, it's the weld on the outside of the egg, mate. But if you're in a studio with 80 odd people looking at you and boom mics and 4 million people watching you live, you're a rabbit in headlights.
Yeah.
So, but we never forget what we understand. So I show people how to understand this topic from the bottom up. So then it stays with them. And if they do go to a dinner party and mention that, I'm studying astrology, and someone gets a birth chart out and puts it in the middle of the table and says, "Tell me about my mother," and the room goes hushly quiet. If they're going to depend on their memory, they won't be able to speak. But if they have an understanding, they'll find themselves going, "Oh, right, okay. Well, your mum was like this, and your mum was like that," and they'll find that it will flow.
Yeah.
So, can we ask you your personal opinion on the soul's journey and how that connects to a person's chart?
Oh, yeah. Well, in a nutshell, I guess I'd say that for me, planet Earth is like a school for souls.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a place where you can learn certain things greed, avarice, jealousy, envy, hatred, sadism, and things. I have no idea what the other schools might be like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, I see some of the great lights of our history, you know, from Buddha to Lao Tse to Confucius to Pythagoras to Jesus, etc. I see them as almost like prefects of this school.
Yeah.
I can't get my head around being a prefect of this world, you know, let alone what might be next. So if this is like the infants, that would mean that those people are in the bottom year of the juniors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are the prefects of that like, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think it would be arrogant of us humans to think that this is the only planet with any life whatsoever in an entirely vast universe.
Yeah.
Whether or not other planets have what we might think of as cerebral life, as opposed to just viruses, is something that, you know, we just don't know. But one might assume that life could have evolved and formed in other places. So for me, this planet is a place where you can learn certain things, and the range of things that we can learn in this world are too vast for one lifetime.
Yeah.
There's far too much, you know. And if you think about it, I mean, for all of our brilliance in art and science, and, you know, you can sew someone's arm back on, and you can paint the Sistine Chapel, and, you know, a man who's deaf can write symphonies and all of that. No matter how good you are, the things you do, relating with a human being is still nigh on impossible. You know, we share 50% of our DNA with a banana. We share 99% of our DNA with the chimpanzee. We don't understand other creatures that we share kind of 100% of our DNA with. We don't understand ourselves. And so that process of learning about human relating for all the other things we might do seems to be something that takes an extraordinarily long time, you know, and to develop a kind of a heart that has kindness and wisdom as a default rather than as a kind of a behavior seems also to take a long time, especially if you're faced with kind of traumas and hatreds and sadism and cruelty. To be able to still hold kindness and wisdom in your heart when you're faced with that is an extraordinary thing to be able to do. But so it seems to me that after lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, we kind of develop that sense within ourselves, because those learnings migrate from one life to another. So I have this notion that before we incarnate, there's some kind of planning stage where whatever you're going to learn, the remit of your assignment sheet, if you like, is kind of basically structured out with all its variations. Because I don't think we learn one thing, we learn multiple things.
Yes.
You know, and so it's like imagine there's a roundabout with, say, 10 roads coming off it, and each one of those roads has certain things along it. So there's one's got a humpback bridge with the duck pond, another one's got a flyover, another one's got a cul-de-sac, and along each of those roads there are people.
Yeah.
And so when we're born, we can kind of choose which one of those roads we go down. And each one of those roads has its own lessons, its own people that we meet, and they're expecting us, but we're also just on one path of theirs, in their multiple options. I tried to get my head around this when I was in my 20s. I tried to imagine the whole thing, because your grandparents and great-grandparents and they'd all have to, all of it is agreed, right? Every life form, cats, dogs, pigeons, chickens, willow trees, everything you encounter is a mutually agreed meeting with the soul or spirit of every life form that you encounter through every life you will ever have. And if you try to get that in your head in one go, it will cause you a great deal of pain.
Yes.
Would that not be a process of surrendering to allow that to happen, David? Rather than,
it does happen.
Because if you try to manage something like that, surely that couldn't happen. It has to be as
it's too much.
The whole has to be almost like a part of that. So what you encounter within that, so there's some kind of soul agreement. What I'm trying to say on a vast surrendering process potentially. And interesting, Anthony, you have a pre-life memory, don't you?
Yeah. We've mentioned this a couple times where we different spiritual talks in the past, David, but for some, well, whether it's bizarre reason or not, I got this preconception or memory of choosing my parents. And this was when I was a child, of actually remembering it as clear as day, as clear as yesterday. And I've still got that. And glad that Paul just brought that up just now, because that brings that back into the forefront of my mind, that thought process of choosing with a team of helpers in a spiritual state, or however it works, to choose which direction of which parents I chose to go with.
And also at the same time, they would have chosen you to become into their path too.
Yeah.
And so that meant that your existence had to exist as a potential before they were born, when they were in their planning room, before they were incarnated.
Right.
And that's what I mean by I tried to go right back to the origin of things, and it hurt. I thought, no, forget it. I'll just accept mystery. So it's much easier just to go, okay, mystery happens, and enjoy mystery without having too much kind of cognitive analysis.
Can I just quickly jump in?
My little brain.
Can I just quickly jump in there, David? Your brain fascinates the life out of me.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a conversation all day, can we?
But also, not just that, the way you articulate everything, but also your journey within this lifetime of learning to be able to help others at a grand level for their existence. But from this, rather than a fascination, but an absolute overall intelligence from an understanding spiritually, or however you want to word it, this form of surrendering that Paul used at the end of the day isn't just in a relaxed state, is it? It's in an absolute blueprint of fine detail to make everything connect together. Would you say that? Do I understand?
I can relate. I can understand what you're saying from if I think about it astrologically.
Right. Okay.
So this language of astrology is incredibly complex. So, for example, in an astrological birth chart, there are the 12 signs of the zodiac around the outside, right? But also inside the wheel, there are 12 compartments, which we call houses.
Yeah.
And you could think of those as the sets on a stage. So imagine there's going to be the play of your life in the theater, right? And around the outside on the floor, there is a ring of lights, the footlights, right?
Yeah.
Up in the loft, there are spotlights. And the stage is divided into 12 compartments or scenes. So there's a set for travel, a set for being with friends, a set for talking to interesting people in a podcast, a set for health, right? And as you do different things in your life, as you go through your day, you're moving from one set to the other, to the other, to the other. And each of these sets has these footlights illuminating it at the bottom. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them have spotlights playing into them.
Yeah.
Okay. So in astrology, the spotlights are the planets, the footlights are the signs of the zodiac, and the houses, if you like, are these areas of life in the middle. So a planet describes a certain behavior that we do. The sign of the zodiac that it's in at the time we're born tells us the manner or style in which we do that behavior. And the house position shows the context or area of life in which that behavior is most likely to be observed or to come about. So, as you know, every theater spotlight is white because all lights are white, all light bulbs are white. But if you put a certain fabric around it or a certain chemical around it, then that chemical will absorb all colors of the light spectrum except for one. So then you'll only see one portion of the light spectrum coming out from that light, a green light, a blue light, a red light. So if you think of a planet as the light bulb and the sign of the zodiac it's in as the filter, so then you get an idea that, Mars, a symbol of expression, in Aries will come out in an Aries way, in Taurus will come out in a Taurian way, in Gemini will come out in a Geminian way.
Yeah.
Okay? But the house position can also be different. So the first house is the house of immediacy. The second house is a house of kind of contemplation and mulling things over. The third house, a house of communication, and so on. So if you get Mars, you filter that through Aries in the first house, It'll be slightly different to Mars in Aries in the second, different again to Mars in Aries in the third. So by the time you're round to the 12th house, you've got 12 variations of Mars in Aries. And by the time you cycle that through Taurus and Gemini, all the way around to Mars in Pisces in the 12th house, there are 144 variations of the style of expression of a human being. And that's just 144 variations of expression. So psychologists, some of them are quite sophisticated, and they have 4 psychological types. If they're doing psychometric profiling, they'll be really sophisticated and maybe have 8 or 16 or even 32. In astrology, we have a base pad of 144, and then we add the complexity of combinations as well. So as a kind of a human modeling system, it's incredibly sophisticated and rarefied. You know, the word guilt, we take it, there are 144 variations of how we express guilt or what we might feel guilty about, as an example. And if you think of every single behavior that you can possibly do and filter that through 144 variations, that gives you a framework of understanding the human condition as a basis. Right? And then when we look at a person's individual birth chart, that gives us the specific subjective structure that they experience life through.
Yeah.
So some astrologers, in fact, a lot of media type astrologers, kind of echo what's been written before in books and things. And there's this kind of perspective or orientation they have, which is to look at people. Right? So it's like being a cosmic zoologist looking at a person. But I teach my students, instead of looking at people, to imagine that your mind is on like a little drone, an astral drone, and you can fly it across and go inside their brain. So then you can see the world how they see it from inside them.
Right.
So
Wow.
like, if you think of, if all the world's a stage and we are but players, right, then everyone has the same script. So a lot of people experience life as if their script is the default script, right?
Yeah.
And if they meet someone who's similar to them, they call them a good person, good bloke, nice geezer, right? If they meet someone who's very different to them, they call them odd, strange, weird, mad, crazy, nuts, right? Other. But another way of looking at it is that humanity is a spectrum. It's a rainbow of diversity. So some human beings, for example, process information very quickly. Other human beings, relatively, process information more slowly. It's a bit like saying some people are on 78 RPM and other people are on 33 RPM and take a long time to finish their sentences.
Yeah, that'll be me after COVID.
So if a 78 RPM person, if a fast processor is in the company of a slow processor, the fast processor will experience a slow processor sounding like a slowed down record.
Yeah.
Right? And they'll be going, come on, get to the point.
Yeah.
Come on, we'll get to the point. Right? Whereas the slow processor experiences the fast processor of someone who's aggressive because they're going, right, come on, let's get done on.
Yeah.
And the only way that a 33 RPM person would move that quickly is if they're in a state of panic or anger.
Right.
So they assume that when they meet a fast processing speaker or talker, that person must be angry because that's the only reason that they would be able to do that. Right? Whereas the fast processing person experiences the slow processing person as being somewhat dim or stupid.
Yeah.
Because that's the only reason they would take so long to answer a question. But they're not. It's just that they don't understand there's a variation, there's a variety of spectrum. So you can look at an astrological birth chart and see in what contexts we're at 33 RPM and in what contexts we're at 78. And that can be really helpful, especially in things like if you're working with someone or, if you're in a relationship, even if you want to understand yourself. How come I can do this part of my life with great fluidity and ease, and yet this area of my life is like a clunky, or I'm like a baby giraffe kind of trying to walk around. Why is it so awkward for me to do that when I can do this so easily?
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating tool of self-illumination.
Yeah.
So David, I understand you deal with regression as well, and you connect that with astrology or separate?
No, that's a separate thing.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, there are parts of an astrological birth chart that indicate dynamics of oneself that you can access from previous lives that filter into this life.
Yeah.
But like, although it might tell you, say, for example, that you might have been literate before, so this time around you'll find articulation and literacy easily, it doesn't tell you that you're a monk in the 12th century or a pig farmer in the 14th century, right? For that information, you need to explore your own memory. And so I know some people that think past life regression is sitting in front of a medium and the medium tells you things about yourself. That's not regression. That's the medium telling you things about yourself.
Yeah.
Regression is where the conscious mind is relaxed sufficiently that you can draw memory from lives you've led before this one. And when I do workshops on it, I often say to people, it could be genetic memory. It could be racial inheritance.
When you say genetic memory, you mean memory of
inside your DNA or something like that.
Yeah.
It could be some kind of collective download.
Okay.
It could be some Darren Brown-esque, extraordinarily sophisticated fantasy on the part of the unconscious, or it could be a past life memory.
Yeah.
The thing is that all of those are fascinating. You know, I mean, what? You can access genetic memory. Whoa. Or if it's a download from the collective, you're remembering someone else's memories. Well, does that mean we can choose whose memories? Can you get David Bowie's memories? Can you get Einstein's memories? Or even if it is a kind of a fantasy on the part of the unconscious, how sophisticated, how amazing is your brain that it would show you the buckle of an 11th century shoe that you have no conscious recollection of ever seeing in a film or a museum.
Absolutely.
And so what I find in regressions is that the memories that people come up with are quite often so sort of ordinary, and sort of not dull, but just kind of mediocre. You know, someone's in a farmstead and they get up when the sun comes up and they go and feed chickens and they get water from a stream and things like this. And I ask them things like, what's on the floor? Do they have holes in the walls? If they do, is there anything in those holes? So I wouldn't suggest glass or shutters, but I want them to tell me, And you find it's the tiny, tiny little things like a costume or a headdress or something that starts to kind of be far more detailed than you'd rationally expect their conscious mind to know.
So is that the key trigger then, that whether you're having a real experience or an ancestral experience, is there key markers in place when someone gives you their experience? Do you yourself know whether it's an actual real past life experience this person is having?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a very good question. I get a like an intuitive sense sometimes that it's a bona fide memory. But my conscious relationship with the person in the moment is to assume that it's a bona fide memory because it's for them to decide what it is, not me. So I keep my own opinion private because I don't want to influence or bias. You know, and if for them, if they have an experience and they say, yeah, that was a past life memory, that was real, then it is. That's for them, their own discovery, as it were.
Sorry, David, another question. So even if that wasn't a real experience, is there something within the soul that wants to release?
Exactly.
So it's giving you an alternative to an experience to help you release that trauma.
Yeah, that's part of the reason for doing it. See, do you remember old FM radios where if you drove from one place to another, and you'd put it on scan and it would just scan, and it lock into the strongest station. So that's how I do the regressions or the framework that I set it up. So at the very, very beginning, their inner mind is asked to give a signal that it wants to go ahead, that it gives permission to go ahead. So, and if it doesn't give permission, then we just stop. But if their inner being gives permission to go ahead, then there's a green light. We can go ahead.
Yeah.
And they're instructed to find a strong memory
Right.
of a life they've lived before this one. So they just kind of home in whatever that is. Quite often, they're highly emotionally charged, and they're sometimes deeply traumatic, because trauma is highly emotionally charged, but so is joy as well, and so is boredom.
Yeah.
Oddly enough. But people suddenly, it's a bit like, do you remember an old program called Quantum Leap, where a person finds it
Very
can be like that. So one person found themselves being bricked up in a cave. There was this woman who said, "Oh, we're on a hillside." And what are you wearing? So I got her to describe her kind of clothing. Is there anyone with you? Yes. There are some people and a man on a horse wearing a hat. What are you doing? We're waiting. What are you waiting for? I have no idea. What's happening now? We're still waiting. All day long, these people were just waiting. And then just before sunset, the man told them very excitedly to wave their arms in the air and look in a certain direction. And far off in the distance, she saw a carriage go between two hills. So at some point in the history of whenever, somewhere on planet Earth, there's a dignity who's going to go across some kind of valley or plain. And these landowners have got all their peasants to stand on hillsides in their Sunday best, waiting for hours, because you can't tell exactly when a horse is going to go by, right? Waiting all day, so that when the carriage goes past, in the distance, they see these silhouettes of people waving on hillsides.
Wow.
I have no idea what benefit that woman had from remembering that.
Yeah.
You know, but yeah, other times it's more kind of obvious. You know, people have it better kind of powerful interactions, or people are in a Holocaust situation or something, and it's obvious that they're releasing some sort of trauma like that.
Yeah.
But even you know, someone remembering being a child in a Victorian telling off room, and kind of waiting and waiting and waiting for something to happen. You can, if you wrote out a list of all the lessons you can learn from boredom and waiting for life to happen instead of enacting with it, you'd have quite a long list of things, if you really kind of contemplate that you can learn from it. So it is useful for a kind of a psychological cleansing perspective, you know.
Do you feel this is more to do with the actual person's memory that they're picking up on, or is it actually coming from an outside force being put into their head?
I would say it's more like this. If you think of the brain almost like a prism, right? So the light of the soul, if you like, comes into that prism, and then it radiates out through into the world. Right? The prism itself has a certain condition about it, and because of the condition of the prism, it can self-generate thoughts as well.
Right.
So some of the stuff we experience might be like from a soul perspective coming in, but some of the thoughts we have are generated from within as well, from our own neurobiology.
Right. Okay.
But the expression of what comes out of us has a correlation with the quality or the condition or the health of the prism. So if the prism has a lot of fractures and fissures and, you know, cracks, then no matter what quality the light is that comes into it, it'll come out in a distorted way. And so going on a kind of a path of self-mastery in whatever form that is, whether that's a martial art or meditation or contemplation or Zen Buddhism or whatever it is, the more you can repair the fractures and cracks in the prism of your own brain or your own psyche, you know, i.e. your psychology, then the more you can have, I guess, a healed light coming through, and you can relate with yourself in a more congruent way, you know. And so I've been on a journey. I've been on that path since I was a child, and I'm hungry for ways to make that easier, faster, smoother, you know. So hence not just doing astrology, but going off and doing kind of what I call neuro-holistic therapy, which is a mixture of NLP, hypnotherapy, and a field called psychobiology. You know, so I think since I did my MSc about 12 years ago, Most of the books I buy are on interpersonal neurobiology and neuroscience. So I read neuroscience stuff for leisure because I'm utterly fascinated by what goes on in here on a chemical level.
Yeah.
You know, so when I started learning NLP and hypnotherapy, you kind of learn in talking therapy world that words have an impact, and language changes things, but you're not taught how.
Yeah.
How does it do that? How does making a sound with your voice cause someone to never smoke cigarettes again? How does that happen on a kind of a chemical level, on a cellular level?
Yeah.
But when you understand how that works, suddenly it makes everything more congruent when you're delivering it, because you know for certain that the sound of your voice will cause another person to relax their shoulders, maybe slow their breathing. And as you begin to do that, you can find that your breathing becomes more easy. And there could even be muscles in your body or your arms or your hands that begin to relax.
You're going to have us all relaxing and sleeping.
Well, yeah. And so knowing how that happens, knowing about mirror neurons, you know, makes it a lot easier to do.
Yeah.
You know.
Did you say mirroring?
Mirror neurons.
Mirror neurons. Okay.
Yes, some Italian guys in about 1999 discovered that every creature that has a spine and a cortex has mirror neurons in their brain. The function of a mirror neuron is to translate an external experience into an internal understanding or comprehension. So we have that. So, you know, if you go to a rock concert, Simple Minds concert, and you see Jim Kerr on stage doing this, and then you look around, you see loads of people doing the same thing.
Yeah.
You know? And so their mirror neuron, he's firing off their mirror neurons, and they're replicating that. You know, but a cow going on up the gangplank into an abattoir, if there's one of its cow friends inside screaming because it's being murdered, those sounds reach that cow on the gangplank, and its mirror neurons comprehends exactly what it's walking into.
Yeah.
And its fear is then comprehended by all the others in the truck that haven't got on the gangplank yet.
Yeah, I've heard that. So,
you know, so yeah, I haven't eaten meat for 31 years.
I've just started. I've just gone vegetarian for last.
Hey, well done, sir.
Oh,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Go further into veganism. It's even more congruent.
Yes.
You know, you can fit. You really feel that you're walking your talk when you're, you know, because if you have a love for all of life, then you like I said, you know, when we were talking before, you can't live without taking life in one way or another.
Yeah.
But you are in control of your damage limitation.
What about helping with the vibration of the food you're eating by blessings? Do you believe in the vibrational quality of that object, that you can bless it? There's been a whole research, isn't there, into blessing your food, blessing things around you to raise that vibration. Do you believe in that, even with diet?
It's nice to have gratitude for things, but it's still better to not kind of cause something to feel kind of kidnapped, tortured, and murdered beforehand.
See, where I work, there's an abattoir nearby. I work 3 days a week, and there's an abattoir, and you can hear them, the animals screaming as they're going in. And it's awful, and the energy and the vibration of that. And if you're slightly sensitive, Anthony, you'd feel that, and straight away it's like, I love sausages, gone. Chicken, gone. It's all gone. So
yeah, I visited an abattoir when I was 14, and it's something that you'll always remember.
Yeah, it's quite haunting, I'd imagine.
Yeah. You know, well, to a certain extent, one of the reasons that human beings can tip or slip into committing atrocities on humans, because they find it so easy to commit atrocities on other life forms.
Yeah.
You know, to an extent. Yeah. You know, we're all. Yeah, it's when you look at kind of like the psychology of serial killers or war crimes and genocides and things like this, you could very easily form the impression that we humans are basically apes with broadband, you know, and we're all just one synapse away from turning into something horrendous. It looks that way, you know. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think that have you heard of a Harvard professor of psychology called Steven Pinker?
No.
Okay, there's a professor of psychology at Harvard called Stephen Bigger, and he wrote a book, must be 8 odd years ago now, called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And it was inspired by another book called The Civilizing Influence by a guy called Elias. And the civilizing influence looks at what it is, how come societies form structural rules of what is culturally appropriate and what is taboo. So there's a whole chapter on spitting. All mammals produce saliva, but in some cultures it's taboo unless you're kind of 15 and you're watching The Clash in 1977, in which case spitting is very, very good to do. But there are very few kind of contexts in which human beings say that spitting is all right.
Yeah.
So where did that come from? Why did this mammal, this articulate mammal, suddenly decide that that's not a good thing, whereas all the other animals slobber and kind of spittle all over the place? So Pinker got interested in this and started to look at cultures and societies going back about 1,000 odd years, and he noticed the pattern. And the pattern is, it seems hard to believe, right? But it's in a thoroughly researched pattern, and that is that over time, all human societies are becoming less tolerant of violence.
Wow.
That doesn't mean that we're eradicating violence, but it means we're becoming less tolerant of it. So there are very few countries now that endorse judicial murder or capital punishment.
Yeah.
So over the last 100 years, the number of countries that have had capital punishment has reduced incredibly. For example, if you go back, say, 400 years, a street urchin could get hung for stealing bread.
Yeah.
In Britain, that wouldn't happen now. So if you look at how people used to treat cats in taverns, they used to do terrible, torturous things to cats in taverns. It's uncomfortable reading it, but that's what was happening in the 1500s and whatever. So when you compare how people have treated, cutting their wives' heads off because they didn't like them, do you know what a scold was?
Scold? No.
Yeah, you might know that. You might know that a parent might scold a child, but the word "scold" comes from a medieval contraption that it was like almost like a metal.
Is that a head brace?
Yeah, that used to go around someone's head, and it would put spikes inside their mouth so they couldn't talk, and that was called a scold. And a husband who was irritated with his wife would put the scold on his wife, and he would be scolding his wife.
Wow.
And that's where that comes from. Yeah. Wow. And so from stuff like that to suffragettes to now.
Yeah. Come a long way.
We've come an extraordinary way.
But then you look across the world and certain societies, and you can see they're 300, 400, 500 years behind a Western society in terms of, how we treat, being misogynistic, how men are towards women.
Yeah.
In different cultures.
There are some. Bandler pointed out in one of his things, Richard Bandler, one of the creators of NLP, that different societies have different relationships with time. So some people orientate their relationship with time as if time is like a line out in front of you, going from left to right or right to left, and you can see things as a journey from past to present to future. Other people experience time as if time is going through them. And so for them, the present is the past and the future is merely an echo of now. So if you remember when 9/11 happened, there were certain parts of the Middle East that were responding as if what was happening was a continuation of Crusades. And when you look at some of the religious cultures, their practices and what they're doing haven't changed since 500 AD. There's absolutely no update, there's no upgrade, there's no change whatsoever at all in certain parts of the world, And so there's this kind of mixture. We as souls, we rub shoulders, but then we have to, because if we are enlightened, intelligent, if we are, then we've come to be enlightened and intelligent because we've gone through the stages of being horrifically sadistic and savage. And we've got so fed up with being savage that like too much chocolate makes a child sick, that we've learned that kindness is a default. But there are other souls who aren't as mature as that. They haven't gone through those lessons yet. They're still in the savage stage. So how can they learn about enlightenment if they don't see it and observe it and touch it and feel it? So we have to rub shoulders with the savage so the savage can learn from us and model us.
Yeah.
Just like, we love it when we meet, an enlightened soul. If you're ever lucky enough to meet the Dalai Lama, that's something you're going to remember for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Just because you're in that person's aura, to be near that level of, wisdom. And so likewise, people who are less wise than us, they get that benefit from hanging around with us as well. The only problem is that if you're in the proximity of savage people, you will get hurt.
Yeah.
Is that more about embracing it, David, rather than learning from it?
It's about embracing it. I think it's more sort of, I guess, accepting the notion that this Earth school has a wide range of people at different levels of understanding and knowledge and wisdom on its surface. And the only way that the unwise can learn is by hanging around with the wise. But that means that the wise elect and choose to go into spaces where you're going to have access to people who are more kind of unenlightened than you, and they will behave towards you in an unenlightened way.
Absolutely.
You know that prior to landing here. And that's part of the beauty of being a guide. Because there's no point in being a guide and kind of telling people who already know where they're going. That's not the thing. The thing is to have contact with the people who don't know things so that you can illuminate them. And in the process of that does mean you get kind of sometimes squashed, hurt, and bitten and trodden on.
Yeah.
So, David, do you see that reflected in someone's astrological chart? That whether they're an evolved soul or whether there's some special qualities within that person? Or
No, you can't tell that. To quote one of my favorite astrologicals is How to Sport Us, if a woman is born in the same time and place and date as a pet frog, their birth charts will be the same, but the woman will express the chart according to her level of consciousness, and the frog will express its chart according to its.
Right.
You can see propensity for pain and trauma and mental illness and things. I did a 3-hour workshop on the astrology of Ukraine and what's happening with the conflict a month or so ago. And we had to look at Putin's chart, and there are 2 indications in Putin's chart for him to have serious mental health problems.
Oh gosh.
Which is not a surprise.
Yeah.
Really. Be a bit weird if they weren't in there.
Yeah.
But because of all of the symbols in astrology are polysemous, one doesn't know how the person is using it. So for example, in Michael Jackson's birth chart, a planet that one could associate with imposition is Pluto. And he had that in the house of the home, which is also the same part of the chart, if you like, as the father, right? So there's an indication there that he could have been abused by his dad. And that's one of the things he said in life, that he was abused by his father. But that could also mean that he could enact abuse within his home as an adult later on.
Okay.
Now, we don't know that that's the case, but the astrological potential is there. But without getting it from the horse's mouth, you can't verify it.
Yeah.
So when you look at Prince Andrew's chart, there are indications there that he could be an adult who engages in impositional sexual activity, i.e., not necessarily worrying about the consent of the recipient.
Okay.
Right? Now, but that doesn't mean he's done that. It just means that we know that astrologically the potential is there.
Yeah.
So again, we're coming back to when the soul chooses its lessons, that maybe it's particularly chosen that particular time of birth because of the lessons it's requiring.
But also within its own kind of the faint and free will polysemy, if you like, or in other words, the roads coming off the roundabout.
Yeah.
Right. We can still choose which of those roads to take. If you think every footstep that you take has 360 degrees coming off it.
Yeah.
So every footstep we take in life has 360 choices. Every single footstep has 360 choices, but we're inclined to take one of them. And neurologically, a synapse free floats, right? And a synaptic junction has lots of neural pathways coming off it, sometimes hundreds of thousands of possibilities. And they all have transmitter chemicals, receptive chemicals, right?
Yeah.
And so the neuron or the thought will go down the pathway of the one that has the strongest chemical.
Right.
So it's more of a deselection process than a selection. So a person who smokes a cigarette, for example, isn't choosing necessarily to smoke consciously. What's happening in their brain is that all the other options are deselected because they've got less of a chemical attraction or less powerful emotive dynamic. So a part of how talking therapy works is you show the brain how to create new pathways, and that these new pathways have more richer emotional dynamic attached to them, whether that's a feeling of success or a feeling of change or a feeling of empowerment or whatever it is, or even a feeling of relaxation. And that those new emotive pathways are stronger than the other old ones. And so the brain just goes in a new direction, and the person experiences changes that their conscious mind wants to experience. So those potentials in an astrological birth chart are shown in the polysemy of the symbols. So the symbol for inspiration and healing is the same symbol for confusion and drug addiction.
Mm-hmm.
So a person, for example, can be a confused child, go down the pub, get drunk, discover blues, become a musician, and then through music discover Zen Buddhism. Or they could have discovered Zen Buddhism when they're young, then found that they've got like a propensity for daydreaming, get diagnosed with having a mental health problem, become a drug addict, and then through that discover music. And so they're going to kind of go down all those different pathways potentially, but not necessarily in the same order or the same sequence. So you can see in a birth chart the potentials of a person, which are incredibly varied, but you don't know exactly which paths they've taken at any different given place in their life unless you have a conversation with them.
Yeah.
So it's why I never look at the charts of people that I'm not in conversation with, because it's just too much. You could spend like hours and hours considering all the possibility of a person, but you've got to do the washing up and make your dinner and live your life. So it's much easier just to look at charts when I'm actually talking to a person. Yeah, but it's fascinating. In my professional classes, when we're looking at a placement that isn't represented by someone in the class, i.e. none of us have got that particular placement, we look at case studies. So we look at famous people and things of people who've got certain placements and see what they got in common, and and how these variables come out in the expressions, whether they're famous artists or actors or Nazis or serial killers or whatever. Yeah.
So David, you're obviously somebody that's impressed by the power of the universe, if you like. Can I ask you a really big question? And I kind of feel this might be a bit too much for a Wednesday morning at 11 o'clock.
You can ask anything you like. I'll do my best to answer.
I'd like your theory on God.
What do you mean by God?
Do you believe in God? Do you believe in a power? How do you see the universe and all things within that?
I can't answer your question until you answer my one first. What do you mean by the word God? I need your definition.
God is in a principle of what binds it all together.
What binds it all together?
Yes, or creation, or I'm going around in circles with this. I'm a big rabbit hole. I'm just going to try and dig myself out.
Okay.
So, in terms of, do you ever see that in what you do in your experience? Because obviously you're a master of science, so you're very much, do you find that having this belief system in a greater power, do you have that? Have you had experience of that?
I was initiated as a witch when I was 20, and I spent most of my 20s leaping over bonfires.
Okay.
So for me, the divine expresses itself in the material plane through different lenses, different expressions.
Okay.
So I'm more inclined to, instead of seeing a unified monad or God as being expressions of gods and goddesses, of deities, as a combination, a pantheon, rather than a singularity.
Yeah.
So I'm a polytheist rather than a monotheist.
Okay.
Yeah. I can understand monotheist religions, and I understand the Abrahamic religions, and I understand a bit of the history of how those theologies came about. But I'm more of a person of antiquity, really. So have you heard of animism?
No.
Okay. Animism can be thought of as a way that people would have related with life around them and with the supernatural before codified religions were written down and established. So, for example, they would have seen everything as having some kind of expression of divinity: clouds, rock, wind, thunder, lightning, etc. There was a wonderful little local documentary on a local druidic priestess many years ago, and she was talking about animism, and she said, when I go out to take the rubbish, I don't think I'm just tipping the rubbish out into the recycling. I'm making an offering to the gods of decay. So, from a logo science perspective, if you put an apple on a wall, it will rot.
Yeah, absolutely.
But from a mythos perspective, the gods of decay remove it.
Oh.
So in her world, everything has divinity, everything has agency. That's animism, right? I like that as well. And to a certain extent, when you think of, we were talking about Egyptian gods and goddesses earlier on, those gods and goddesses are expressions of different facets of that animism. So I like that. I like the richness of that.
Yeah.
In that kind of thinking, even the Mesopotamian Inanna and Ereshkigal, the light goddess and the dark goddess below, neither of them are lesser or greater than the other. They're just different facets of reality. So death is a part of life.
Yes.
If you live with a conscious sense of mortality, you'll actually live a richer life. Because if you kind of know that any day could be your last, but also that tomorrow you get the full consequences of all of your actions, and you kind of move into this place of almost like living a responsible party.
And isn't that a shame that more people can't have that belief system?
Well, I think some people have notions of some kind of supernatural, if you like, or divine or God, but because of the ways that the theology of the Abrahamic religions are structured, it's all about punishment and terrible things. And have you ever heard of a thing from NLP called a negated command?
No.
Okay. Have a go at this. Close your eyes without closing them, and do that now. Close your eyes without closing them. Without closing them. Close your eyes without closing them. Close your eyes without closing them.
That's an oxymoron, surely.
Okay. I'm always doing that. I'm sorry. I told you to do something and not do something in the same sentence. Essentially, I said, do something not. And you didn't close your eyes, right? Even though I told you to.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you know that your brain, you have a conscious mind and an unconscious. And you can think of it like your conscious mind can contemplate things that aren't there. But your unconscious, your central nervous system, can only respond to phenomena that exists.
Yeah.
So if I said to you, don't think of a big blue dog with yellow stripes, and that's exactly what you just did, right? Yeah. Even though I told you not to do it, and you're doing it again. So what happens is that you might believe that you're listening to my voice. You're not listening to my voice. What's that? I'm vibrating the air. The air is touching this thing here called a microphone. It's then that vibration is transduced from kinetic energy into electrical current. That goes along a cable, gets transduced into fiber optics, goes up the satellite, bounces down your end, gets transduced into electricity, gets transduced into kinetic energy, vibrates the air, touches your inner ear, and your brain gets the word don't. And in maths, as you know, plus and minus cancel each other out.
Yeah.
So the first word your brain hears is the word don't. So what your brilliant unconscious says is erase that, forget it, because it neutralizes. So the next thing is think of. And your brain goes, oh, think of what? A big, find a big. Blue, shade of blue. Dog, select a dog from all the others. With yellow stripes, dum, dum, dum. And then it knows what to not think of before it can remove it.
Yeah.
And that happens in a millisecond. Right?
Yeah.
So kidding on the climbing frame, mum looks up and says, don't look down, you'll fall. And he goes, what? Ah, don't touch that, it's hot. Don't touch that, it's hot. Don't touch that, it's hot. So if you give a person instruction and you put a negation at the front of it, there's a very high chance they'll do the opposite of the instruction.
Yeah.
You know, don't look at me like that. Don't you say you'll let me down. You'll hear this in supermarkets now. You'll be kind of waiting, and somebody saying, yeah, anyway, I said to him, I said, don't you take that. And he went and took it. I think, yeah, well, that's because you told him to, right? So when you think of the Abrahamic religions, a lot of their instructions or rules are written in negations.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't fancy next door's wife. So, you know, it tells them to do it. Whereas at least with Buddhism, you're told what to do. You know, relax, be kind. That's it. It's nice and easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, so yes. A lot of the Abrahamic legends have at their core a sense of kind of rightness or righteousness.
Is this where all the persecutions came from, David, as well?
Sorry?
Is this where all the persecutions came from as well? Because of not to do it, and they did something.
That one.
No, Aristotle was he wrote a thing called the Great Chain of Being. Right. And he kind of wrote down this structure of the value of life forms. So he said at the top there is the divine, or they called it the prime mover.
Yeah.
Below that there are angels, and who are like ambassadors of the divine. Right. And below angels there are daemons. That's D-E-A-M-O-N, not demon. And a daemon is a being of consciousness that's so elevated they're cast into the stars to see forevermore, like Perseus and Hercules. And modern ones might be Nelson Mandela or Bex, right? And below them you have mankind, then the animal kingdom, then the plant kingdom, then the mineral kingdom. So he put life forms in a hierarchy, and he had a pupil called Alexander, who became the Great. And so wherever an army goes, it takes its philosophy with it. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the most prevalent religion prior to Islam was a thing called Zoroastrianism. You know, a very famous Zoroastrian. His name was Freddie Mercury. Freddie Mercury grew up in a place called Zanzibar, and Zoroastrianism is still the dominant religion in Zanzibar. Right?
Okay.
So Zoroaster was the first person in history to say that there was a fight between light and dark. So before that, wind was just wind, clouds were clouds, rain was rain, death is death. None of them were intrinsically bad. They just are. But he was the first person to say, no, there is some kind of divine or supernatural thing playing you like pieces on a chessboard. Are you for light? Are you for dark? He was also the first person to say that when you die, something external judges you. So remember we were talking about the weighing of the souls before that, which is like self-assessment. So Zoroastrianism is after the Egyptian empire, right? So you have a Middle East where there's this notion of light and dark. You have a Middle East where there's notion of external judgment. And then when they're invaded by the Greeks, this notion of hierarchy gets seeded into all of that around the time of the beginning of the Abrahamic texts, i.e. the beginning of Judaism, which has an offshoot, which is Christianity, which has an offshoot, which is Islam, right? So in the core theology of the Abrahamic religions, it's this sense almost of singular rightness, there is a right path that takes you to light and God, and all of the other paths, by definition, are therefore wrong, and they will take you to the devil or evil or bad. That's it, black and white.
Right.
So when a 13th century Dutchman who's Christian lands upon a continent that he's never been to before, and he sees a black man, he says, "Are you the same as me? No. Therefore, you are other. And because you're other, that means you're lower in the chain of being than me. Therefore, you're an animal, and I can treat you like cattle." You know, that's how, I mean, like Goebbels, apparently in the cinemas in Berlin, they'd have their version of Pathé News in between films.
Yeah.
And they'd show kind of footage of Jews walking down the street and then rats going down drains. So in the minds of the viewers, it went Jews, rats, Jews, rats, Jews, rats, Jews, rats. So they started to see these people as other, as vermin. And of course, very intelligent people then come up with very sophisticated ways of getting rid of vermin, because that's what you're supposed to do. You know, I read the other day that Russian soldiers at Mariupol were, as civilians were leaving, were getting to take their shirts off, because if they had a tattoo, they would kill them because they were Nazi, because they were told anyone with a tattoo is a Nazi.
Wow.
Wow.
And that's how they're telling you in their model how to know if someone is other.
That's unbelievable.
It's not unbelievable. It's very believable if you understand humanity like that.
Unbelievable from a point of view of not knowing that.
It's horrific.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely horrific, and it's very brutal.
Yeah.
You know, but these people have been told by their, you know, media that they're going into a place to liberate people from Nazis, and there's no Nazis there.
No Nazis there.
So in their brain, they have to kind of make people into Nazis. Apparently, a 16-year-old girl was raped in the street in front of her sister, with these soldiers screaming at her that she was a Nazi prostitute.
Wow.
You know, because they have to justify what they're doing. You know, nice people can't do horrible things unless they feel there's a very strong justification for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, so these notions of othering, and so I guess over the last 2,000 odd years, most Hollywood scripts, fairy stories, Bollywood scripts have had those notions built within them.
Yeah.
You know, even commercials. You know, there'll be this household uses Dazo soap powder and their children have blonde hair and perfect teeth, but next door don't use Dazo soap powder and look at how terrible they look. You know, this notion that this is the way and the other way is therefore wrong. You know, it makes you want to vote for the right thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You see how powerful that is now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's been an absolutely brilliant interview this morning. We can't thank you enough for coming on.
Thank you very much, David.
Yeah, but we just want to ask you one more question before you go. We always ask what's next for our guests. What are you planning to do next? I know you've got something coming up at Glastonbury soon, haven't you?
No, not Glastonbury. No. There's a couple of things. I've got a new introduction to astrology starting in May. People can catch hold of me on Facebook if they just type David Charles Rowan.
Yeah.
And
your website.
Yeah, or they can email me as well.
Yeah.
If they're interested in that. It's an online course.
Right.
So as long as you've got good internet access and a laptop or a computer, because you need a big screen, really, or a tablet even, you can join in with that. And that's an 18-week course. And you've got an idea of how I sound and what I talk about and the level of my kind of teaching from this. So my brain looking at astrology, some people let me know, it makes the whole thing even more of an adventure than they otherwise thought it would have been.
Yeah.
But another thing I'm doing on the 10th of August this year is a tour of Stonehenge and Avebury. It's a 12-hour day. So we start at 9 a.m. in Avebury, and there's a 20-minute talk on the history and astronomy of Avebury. Then we walk around, and I point out things that archaeologists can see. So tourists look around it, they see what's obvious in front of them. But archaeologists can look at a flat field and tell you that there's a thing there, there's a city there, there's a this there and then that there. So I keep up to speed with the latest digs and ideas and attend lectures and things. And so I point out the latest theories around Avebury. And then we get in our cars and we drive to each of these significant monuments in the Avebury area. And there are talks and lectures at each spot. We drive across Salisbury Plain and have lunch in the middle of Salisbury Plain. And then in the afternoon, we go to where the Henge builders lived. And so we walk around these high ridges, and you can see Stonehenge in the background, in about 2 miles away.
Yeah.
And walking these places, you definitely get the feeling that just the piece of dust passing through, and this enduring landscape would outlive us, you know.
Yeah.
And if you're lucky, you'll come back here again and enjoy it again, because it'll still be here. We then, once we've walked around the antiquities there, go to this beautiful pub by a river, and they let me use their decking area to give a lecture. So there's a 1-hour lecture there of the astronomy and history of Stonehenge. I think the whole day has a total of about 23 lectures. And some of them are 1 hour, some of them are just 5 minutes. You know, they vary in length. But I don't just stand and talk. I have A3 laminated graphics, you know, so everything has a visual kind of content. And then we go inside the very middle of Stonehenge itself, not round it. We go in it at sunset. While we're inside there at sunset, I draw a huge astrological chart on a piece of AO size paper of the astrology of the moment that we're in there. So I read the tone of the moment, so that those who want to kind of, while they're in this temple, kind of send healing or contemplate something or consider things, I can advise them as to the most kind of appropriate kind of celestial wind, if you like, so they can take advantage of the flow of things rather than swim against the tide. And it's a profound thing to do. And part of the reason for doing that whole tour leading up to it, you know, we could do that in a village hall with tea and biscuits and slides, but you wouldn't feel it. You know, when you walk this landscape, you think they move rock from there to here, and I'm just walking it, carrying my bottle of water, and it's hard work for me. You know, how motivated were these people to do this stuff?
Yeah.
And so most of the questions have been answered, because while we're walking between these places, you know, you can catch up and talk and chat, get to know people a bit. And so by the time you go inside Stonehenge, almost all of your questions have already been answered through the day.
Yeah.
You know, so it's kind of like you walk in and your feet are slightly tired. You've been walking on ley lines all day, so you're buzzy. You know, the day just goes by in a flash. And because your left brain is basically saturated, all you want to do is just sit, and the right brain opens and you can feel it. You know, that these stones have heat coming out of them in certain places, and you can put your hand in front of the stone and feel hot temperature coming out of a rock.
Oh, right.
It's an astonishing thing. The blue stones, as you know, come from Wales, about 170 odd miles away.
Yeah.
The rest of the stones come from the Marlborough Downs, and they're a certain stone called sarsen stone. And between here and Southampton, there was a layer of sandstone that got infused with silica, and it was crushed under a mile of ice at the end of the Ice Age.
Yeah.
And so sarsen stone is sandstone that's basically infused with quartz. And if you catch it in the right light, you can see them twinkle as well. So as you know, if you put pounds of pressure on a quartz crystal, it releases electromagnetic energy charge.
Yeah.
These things are tons in weight.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And you can feel the heat coming out of them.
Oh, that sounds brilliant.
Yeah. And so to do contemplation or send healing or whatever it is inside there is a very, very powerful thing to do.
That sounds good.
And, yeah.
And this is all on your website as well, David.
Yeah, I gave you a link, a direct link to the page of it as well. So if anybody wants the information out there, just write to me and I'll send them the direct.
I'll put it up tonight as well for people, so they got it as well.
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much for doing that.
No problem. Yeah. But thank you for agreeing to come on, David. It's been really fascinating.
It's my pleasure. I'd have to say that the Stonehenge thing has limited spaces, by the way.
Okay.
How many people?
I think 6 have been booked out already, so there are 24 left.
Right. Okay.
So it's a very small group, you know.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful to be able to go inside there in silence.
Yeah.
I know it's open at 4 times a year on the solstices and equinoxes.
Yeah.
But that's when you're in there with other people who are kind of banging drums, making noise and things.
Yeah.
To go in there in a small group and literally just hear a pin drop.
Yeah.
It's
powerful.
It's rare.
Indeed. Yeah. So I do that once a year, just once a year.
Okay. Opportunity not to be missed, people.
Yeah.
Sounds great. But yeah, thanks again. And hopefully we can get you back on the show in the future, David.
Oh, I'd love that. Yeah. And I have to say, what a fascinating conversation with you guys. I want to learn more about you. In fact, if you write to me and let me know your time, date, and place of birth, I'll send you your astrological chart pack so you can
Oh, wow.
Brilliant. Okay.
Wow.
give you some information on the different kinds of readings and things I do as well.
Oh, brilliant. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. Very nice to get to know you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
thanks, David.
My
Yeah,
pleasure.
brilliant.
Have
Thanks
a good day.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot, David.
Awesome, mate. We're back. Thank you, everybody, for watching. It has been an interesting interview. Some controversial subjects. Can you still hear me, buddy? Are you muted? I think you're muted, mate. There you go.
Oh, thank you.
I don't know how you got muted.
Neither do I.
But yeah, some interesting ideas and concepts, and we can't thank David enough for coming on. There is another little video. What we're gonna do is we're gonna put that onto YouTube. But David, later on, we start talking about Mercury retrograde.
Put it on YouTube.
So yeah, we'll put that on YouTube as well as added content. It's interesting talking about Mercury retrograde and David's opinion. So
yeah, there's been a lot of information tonight. It's been longer interview than was expected. So I hope everyone found that very interesting as much as we did. But yeah, you can always go on there at a later date and listen to other pieces of information David was talking about if you've run out of time listening tonight.
Yeah, have a look on our YouTube pages. What's your page called, mate?
Just Anthony Doveton Medium.
Okay.
Yeah, on YouTube. So yeah,
okay, cool. Just search our. We'll put the links in on our pages anyway, so people can have a look. But we're back next week with another great guest. We've got a medium coming on next week, and we're going to be doing the messages.
Back to messages.
Back to messages next week. But what we need to do, mate, is pick somebody for a free reading.
Are you picking it then?
Do you want me to pick?
Yeah, if you pick.
Okay.
Maybe a name that I haven't seen before.
Okay, let me just check it. I have to go to check into my Facebook because that's the best way to check who shared. Okay. Just bear with me. I believe. Do you know what? I can't even see it on here. So I'm just going to pick. So I hope somebody from random. Okay. I'm going to go. I think who's put on here? Shared. Wowzers. Sorry, mate. This is like a delayed out. Okay, here we go. I'm going to go Emma Elizabeth.
Rightio. Congratulations, Emma.
Congratulations.
Back with you soon.
Brilliant. So, mate, it's time to say goodbye, and we'll be back this time next week at 8 o'clock.
Absolutely.
Take care, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Take care, everyone.
See you. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Cheers.